This podcast is a part of the Garnett Media Group podcast network. Garnett Media Group is the official partnership between student-run media outlets at the University of South Carolina. For more information on GMG podcasts or other student work, visit garnettmedia.org. Hi, my name is Dr. Jabari Evans, and welcome to Uncommon Knowledge, the podcast where we talk about all things spanning race and representation within mass media. This podcast is a partnership between the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of South Carolina and Garnett Media Group. So without further ado, let's get into this week's episode.
Hello and welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I am your host, Dr. Jabari Evans, Assistant Professor of Race and Media at USC Columbia, as well as a visiting scholar at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. And for those of you who are new to this podcast, I'm grateful to have you join me as I talk with scholars, journalists, and media makers about their work as it concerns issues of race in journalism, new media, as well as mass communication. Our guest today is Tyler Bunzey, Assistant Professor of Cultural Studies at Johnson C. Smith University, as well as the Program Coordinator for their Cultural Studies program. His teaching relates to the history of popular music and race, but very specifically, he thinks about hip-hop studies, critical race theory. Very infamously, you created a course on Rapsody called Rapsody's Eve. You've also put together courses on hip-hop feminism, critical race theory, as well as the history of hip-hop, and you're also a journalist. So, your voice and storytelling, it knows no bounds in terms of thinking about just scholarship and talking to those in the ivory tower. And thank you for joining us in person. You are the third guest to join in person and the first guest to not be a part of a classroom experience to join us in person. So I thank you for your time. I mean, I know Charlotte isn't so far, but it's still a drive, and I still appreciate your time, and I appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, no, I'm super happy to be here, and thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure. I'm looking forward to chopping it up.
No doubt. So, I mean, just overall, before we even get into some of the questions that I have, how did your journey into academia start?
From way left field. So originally, I was supposed to be a pastor. That's why I was studying pastoral leadership at Liberty University. Not necessarily something that I talk about all that often, but I was there, immediately was kind of disenchanted. I grew up very, very devoutly evangelical, conservative Christian, and was already kind of working my way out of that in high school, but was leaning forward before I worked my way out, if that makes any sense.
Right.
And I started to really dig into the texts, and as I dug into the texts, I couldn't continue to practice my religious practice in that way. And then while I was really used to text, so then I went into English. When I was in English, I started to think about music and the relationship between music and text, and there's actually, believe it or not, an African-American history or African-American literature course offered at Liberty. Took that, was really interested in the relationship of that and popular music, and then started trying to write about it from there and wrote my honors thesis on Kendrick's Section 80, which took some convincing, I'll tell you, from some of the leadership, but kind of went from there, got a lot of stuff wrong, and wanted to keep figuring that out. And so then the next step was to go into a PhD and go that route.
That's real. I mean, you talked a little bit about pushback, and I think that's something that, I speak quite a bit about on this podcast, but also when I talk to students who have visions of maybe even doing an undergraduate thesis or maybe even getting a master's degree, and they don't have an understanding that culture and the study of culture can be rigorous. At what point do you feel like, that whole pushback that comes along with wanting to study Black culture or wanting to study Black music, or even taking leaps of faith and wanting to study something that seems as a case study almost? Are we at a place now where that can be more encouraged, do you think? Or do you think it's still even with hip hop being 50 years in and hip hop scholarship being about 30, 35 years in, do you think it's still at a space where people kind of are in that pushback?
That's a good question. And I gotta cite, A.D. Carson and his idea of the illicit, licit, and especially in terms of hip hop studies. I actually just was able to see him deliver a keynote at the European Hip Hop Studies Network in Cork, Ireland, and spend some time listening to some of his work. And I think that's a good guide for us to think about the way in which hip hop is both authenticating and still this kind of, it's authenticating by its otherness, if that makes sense in an academic setting. But the question itself is kind of hard because in a context in which the humanities are continually being questioned in terms of their academic value, like literature is starting to get treated as if it's an optional subject that's just for fun or just a little seasoning or something like that, instead of something that is a core and vital aspect of education. So when I think about that too, it's like, yeah, hip hop is still in this strange space of kind of like 1 foot in and out of the academy, but at the same time, with the humanities shrinking, the space becomes much more competitive at the same time.
So true. So true. I mean, I think one of the things that I've been thinking about more recently, especially with all the 50th anniversary of hip hop stuff, is sort of like, how do we even define hip hop in this day and age? Because I think even in teaching it in the classroom, I've found that there's almost 3 eras of hip hop, right? And there's the community version, where it's sort of in person, in community centers, in park and recreational spaces, happening in the neighborhood for the neighborhood. And then there's this second phase where, sure, it's beyond one's space and place where their feet are planted, and it spreads from maybe one borough in New York to another borough, and yes, there's other people who are starting to catch wind of it, primarily through Sonic. And then I think this third wave is a very visual culture.
Absolutely.
That, still integrates the songs, still deals with lyrics, still even at times talks about the neighborhood and the hood, whatever, the community, in ways that are transformative. But I think the visual aspect of it has sort of taken over in terms of what we see most visibly about the culture. The other thing is that, the culture is global. Mm-hmm. And so local contexts matter more so than ever. I had Larry Foreman on, and we talked about that. And, he's, his book is probably one of those books that sits in the pantheon of hip hop studies.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, when someone like Trisha Rose, right, says that rehabilitation of community is the mission of hip hop, and she makes that the premise of her book, is that necessarily the case anymore?
I think I'm skeptical of anyone at any time who says that something singularly is a premise of hip hop. I think that there's a lot of allure in that.
Yeah.
And hip hop gives us a ton of opportunities to say this is exactly what it is, right? Because hip hop is a dynamic culture that's always in the act of defining itself.
Yeah.
It's always locatable in some way, but at the same time, it's also not confinable. Yeah. As soon as you try to confine hip hop in any sense, it's going to kind of slip into a different space altogether. And so, I think even with the controversy surrounding the Olympic breakdancer, from Australia, or even breaking in the Olympics at all, right, as a form of institutionalization, or the Next Level program that the State Department runs, right? Is that less hip-hop than some kid rhyming on a corner? Is that less, or is it more hip-hop because it's institutionalized and reified and recognizable in a certain way? Or is some kid in Kazakhstan who has old Public Enemy tapes, who's now making a new mixtape, or not even recording anything, but practicing with his friends in a certain way, is that more or less hip-hop than the Drake-Kendrick beef? You know what I mean? It's something that I think, again, it's almost so sexy to define it, because hip-hop is always saying, this is what I am.
Right.
And at the same time, I think that definition to me, the only definition, like hip hop is just a practice. Like that to me, and a practice is always ongoing.
Yeah.
And so to me, I try to always place definition and practice in that sense. But outside of that, any sort of hip hop is, or hip hop exists too.
Right.
As many examples as there are to back that up, there's like 50 counter examples sitting right around the corner. Yeah.
No, that's real. I mean, I think a lot of that does point to generational participation, right? I think most of like my mentors, or those who were like maybe a generation older than me, or maybe 2 generations if you want to go like 80s and late 80s, early 90s, I think they saw it as boots to the ground because that's what they lived. I'm being confronted with this same sort of generational thing right now where, like, yes, I saw the web, but I saw web 2.0, I saw web 1.0. My own career kind of existed within the blog era where I'm like now dealing with students who were born when I was doing that work, and they're like, right, what is a vlog and why is it important to music at least?
Yeah.
Why would it matter that you put a song on a blog? Why would that be, you know, a part of a revolution or a part of something we consider to be an era when anyone can blog at this point in time?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm seeing that shift now into, you know, streaming era where more and more those barriers to entry are less and less, but then also isolation is a part of how the culture is produced versus being in community. Even in my space era, I still felt like there was a community, or even when there was the open mic or the cipher, like those practices are somewhat lost in terms of actually just happening spontaneously and organically. And I've talked to you a little bit as I've started to write my book, and now it's finished, but like the premise of civics being something that hip hop is driven by, and how we need to sort of redefine civics. I'm wondering how you feeling about like hip hop's current ability to create local scenes. Do you think that sort of like the streaming era or technology has sort of watered down the ability for people to still feel in community with one?
That's a good question. I think if you think about, like, one of the things that I think was very unique about the way that hip-hop circulated, especially in the 80s and 90s, as it entered into a commodity market, is that it gave people access to the hyper-local in ways that before were almost impossible if you were not there physically, right? So to the point where, like, 10 blocks had a sound that the other 10 blocks didn't have. You know, and of course, this is a way longer history. Like, when we think about the Great Migration and the way that it reformed American cities, you know, these enclaves always existed in these microcultures. It was always there, but hip-hop gave a voice to that, especially in the wake of Reaganomics and all of that. So if we think about localization like that, then that's not possible anymore with technology because of the ways that technology makes that too accessible. Because part of the thing is the push-pull of the boundary, right? That, like, you had to not let certain people in and define the space in order for that space to be defined that way. But I think now, you know, I even think about, like, Charlotte and specifically working with a lot of musicians and a lot of, like, people who consider themselves a part of hip-hop culture in Charlotte. Like, we do not have a sound. And that's something that some people lament because it's like, you know, we don't have, you know, that block sound or whatever. And we don't have a formalized industry in the way that Atlanta has a formalized industry. We don't have studios like, you know, other spaces that have that defined sound have studios. So a lot of people would say that, you know, Charlotte hip-hop doesn't have the local kind of vibe that other places have. And I would just strongly disagree with that. It's just much more practice-based. It's about the ways in which, like, I think about Archive Charlotte, a coffee shop on the west side of Charlotte that my friend Charisse owns, and the way in which that space is a space for creatives to all gather.
Right.
And if you're not in the West End or in the Northwest Corridor, you're probably not going to that place, right? And East Charlotte folks gather in other places and stuff like that. You know, I'm more familiar with the West Side, but, like, when we think about that, that's as local and vibrant as anything else, but it doesn't look or sound like local 20, 30 years ago. Because of the way that tech gives us access, I was just looking at some of Surf Mitchell's work a few minutes ago, and what Nigel Malone is doing with Colorful Noise, the way they're documenting that scene, hyper local, but they're making it accessible so that other artists around Charlotte or other people from outside of Charlotte can immediately plug into that hyper local context. And that's the way that technology, I think, creates new local spheres rather than abolishing or destroying what local means.
That's a great point. I mean, I think one of the things that I came into trying to even talk about civics and like how we can place hip hop in the classroom in a way that's a little bit more organic, a little bit more space and place oriented, and a little bit more meaningful to students even at the elementary school level that are coming into academic spaces. I was initially having like rose-colored glasses on, thinking like, okay, like the way to get funding is to say, hey, what we're doing here also is doing STEM, and what we're doing here is also going to affect test scores, and what we're doing here is going to, kind of be transformational in a way of just putting hip hop into the building or shoehorning it into these categories like I just named is going to be helpful. And I found the opposite to be the case, that not all young people participate in hip hop on such a deep level. Many are just casual fans. Some also don't even view themselves as hip-hop being their identity. It's more just, say, a musical genre I listen to from time to time. Even their relationship to artists and artistry is different. And what I had to come to realize now is that maybe, and this is something Adam Cruz, who's a music education scholar, he talks about this, maybe hip-hop is less in today's day and age about, okay, can you quote Jay-Z, and okay, what are you wearing fashion-wise? And maybe it's more about mindset of how you approach the world. It could be comedy. It could be how you tweet. It could be, the way in which you use hashtags. It could be the way in which you make skits. It could be a lot of different things. It could be activism, right? And I'm wondering, and this is just me throwing something against the wall here, if we need to reframe like when and how we use hip hop as a musical genre, and then when we're speaking about the culture, what are we talking about? Because I think a lot of stuff is derivative of hip hop culture. And because it's been so defined by race, gender, class, and it being a musical genre, the sort of seams are not able to be seen in terms of how hip hop impacts so many things, whether just even thinking about remix culture in and of itself, and sampling as an art or being central to how we even communicate in today's environment. That's so hip hop, but no one really points to it as being that. Thinking about it in those terms, could we then look at scenes as being like digital spaces as well?
Yeah, I think so. Like just to reflect on some of the earlier parts of your question too, like I think, and we're on the campus of a PWI, of course, right? And I work at a HBCU. Yep. And I'll tell you, and I've taught at PWIs as well, and I'll tell you, I don't, like in terms of hip hop as a cultural practice, to have students who are intimately and actively engaged with hip hop as a cultural practice is an extreme rarity. Yeah. But all students in some way are familiar with hip hop. And I think that the reason for that, and often speak in the language of hip hop without having any sort of concept or idea, and dress in some ways in the kind of like visual idiom of hip hop, right? And so that, I think, my understanding of that, and I don't think this is a controversial take, is that hip hop circulates primarily as commodity. So what people are buying and selling hip hop when they don't know that they're buying and selling hip hop. When people tune into the Olympics and are like, "Oh my God, I love that segment with Snoop," they're buying hip hop, right? Without thinking of Snoop as "Murder Is the Case That They Gave Me Snoop," you know?
Yeah.
And instead, it's Martha Stewart Snoop because that commodity circulates in a certain way. So when I think about that, right, then we know that hip hop as commodity is different than hip hop as practice, which is different than hip hop as culture, which is different than hip hop as music, and we can get into the with nation and language, and you can, I think it actually, I wish that there were different names for this because I think parceling it out is very valuable because even on the academic level, you read peer-reviewed, lauded academic books that often misconstrue or misunderstand or slip between hip-hop as commodity or hip-hop as culture or whatever, right? And mistaking the two can deeply misunderstand where the articulation is coming from when it comes to, like, the power that's in that articulation. So, when I think about that, I think hip-hop absolutely can create these, like, digital spaces and can create these digital communities. I think, to me as an educator, that is such a tool because I can look at a 60-year-old and say, the reason you called me dude just now is because 30 years ago you flipped on MTV and instead of seeing Bowie, you saw DMC or whatever, right? And so with that gives an inroad into almost any conversation about branding, about nationhood, about diplomacy, about musical history. I think that the misunderstanding, though, can be deeply violent at times, right? And often is, to be honest. I think that it, at the very same time, gives a great opportunity to show people the ways in which hip-hop has almost circulated to the point of being unrecognizable, which I think is a pretty phenomenal thing, and I don't mean that in a positive way. I just, like, it is a phenomenon that I think we need to grapple with, that hip-hop has circulated so much that it's almost become invisible.
Yeah. No, I mean, I had a undergraduate student at Northwestern who actually called me and, like, wanted me to, like, help with her thesis. And part of what she was talking about is, like, in a watered down way, she was saying, like, well, what is hip hop's relationship to pop music? And I was trying to explain to her that, like, pop music is really just, like, there's no style that is pop music, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's a vector of time and, what's going on in society and sonically. But I was trying to explain to her that hip hop is very classic. Yep. And specifically when you think about, like, the digitization of music production, a lot of that's been borrowed from hip hop. Sampling is now not just germane to hip hop, and I think the digitization of how things are have sort of just made a regression to the mean where, like, everything kind of has a similar sound. And now that we have data analytics, it's become even more difficult to say Lotto is pop, Nicki Minaj is rap, right, and Gucci Mane is, this other thing. Like, it's kind of all the same, and I could even turn on a record that's country in today's day and age and still find elements of hip hop in it. Mm-hmm. It may not end up on the hip hop chart, so that's a whole different discussion because genre is largely tied to these other constructs. But I'm wondering if by limiting hip hop to being seen as this commodity in the music industry, we're doing a disservice. And maybe even in thinking about hip hop as a commodity, we need to get out of the box of, like, you're a rapper.
Yeah.
And maybe that is sort of like, and this is something that even I talked to Rupe about when I was in Boston. He's just like, don't call me a rapper at this point. Like, I'm not a rapper. It's just like, what I do is not that, and I've been like, when did rap or to be a rapper become, like, such a, I don't know, pejorative terminology? Is like, can you think of a point in time when that shift sort of took place?
Not to be too much of a professor about it, but like, to me, I think about like Miles Davis playing with his back to the audience. That's when a rapper became overdetermined. Because I think to be a black performer in a white supremacist context that simultaneously needs to consume the black consumer, the black performer, but also rejects the black performer at the same time, that's a overdetermined existence that some people lean into, right? And I think that the mogul like leans into that and says, okay, if I'm going to be hyper consumed, then I'm going to leverage all of these spaces in which I'm going to be hyper visible, hyper consumed, hyper accessible, be the spokesman for everything, and take as much as I can out of this, right? There are some people who completely try to duck it, right? And I think with what you're talking about with Lupe, not to speak for him, by in any means, but I'm saying like Lupe definitely raps,
Yes.
right? But by saying I'm not a rapper, it's like this kind of you don't get to call me that, which means you don't get to associate me with this, and this, So when I think about that, I think that it is a long, long history that comes out of that rappers activate. But because rappers activate that, like when I think about rap going commercial, we're thinking late 80s, early 90s. I know Rapper's Delight's way earlier, but I'm thinking about the hyper commercialization. That's the same time in the 24-hour news cycle. That's the same time that advertising becomes multinational in the way that it has. It's the same time where you get these multicultural city centers, like where Tokyo and London now all have the Chanel store in the same place kind of thing, And I think that all of these things have to be, like the rise of global capitalism and the rapper becoming hyper-commodified has to be seen in the exact same vein. Because I think that there's no disentangling them. And if that would have existed 40 years earlier, we'd be consuming Coltrane the way that we consume Tupac, And like the way that everyone buys Carolina jerseys because Pac wore it one time without knowing anything about, Chapel Hill or whatever. Yeah. Like that would have happened 60 years earlier if those things would have linked in the same way at the same time. But I think it's the historical conjuncture that places it there. And now that we've amplified, and now we have every way of communicating essentially has a way for you to buy something. Mm-hmm. Even when I text you, my phone says you could pay him, and I think that like that's really telling that like even a personal communication, the option's right there for commerce, right? And so I think that we have to, and I'm not even moralizing that. I don't think it's good or bad. It's just where we're at. But I think it creates a space in which to be called a rapper means that you get signified in a certain way. You add racial scripts on top of that, and the story's kind of already been told as soon as you open your mouth.
Yeah. That conversation sort of trailed off into this space of like, and it's funny you mentioned Coltrane and Miles, because it's like, that's sort of what the conversation ended up sort of moving into is like, okay, well, we have to like differentiate them. There are people who are rapping to be in the industry or to gain some sort of fame or profit or clout in a way that maybe I'm not doing. And maybe the craft of lyricism or looking at what I do is more akin to poetry, but then also more akin to something that is practiced in a way that isn't necessarily meant for those who sit outside of this master level of lyricism, right? Like that like, okay, I'm practicing this to show other practitioners how good I am at this, not to hit this Billboard chart thing. And, we used to do that whole, like, you're an MC, you're a rapper
right
thing, to sort of try to delineate that. But as people perform less and less, and it's more about like what you're doing in the studio and the craft of what it is to write in the studio, that then in of itself becomes the things that I think maybe what we start to emphasize at the academic higher education level, as we bring in folks like Killer Mike to talk about what it means to be a rapper or whatever, or we start bringing in people like Jay Electronica or people that, are seen as being masters of the craft that maybe weren't academically validated in the way that maybe you or I have been, but like they still have something valuable to add to someone who's trying to study hip hop. Absolutely.
Yeah.
The one thing I did want to kind of do switching gears is to think about, how hip hop, as much as it's been about class and it's been about race, it's also been very much a black male sport. And how, as much as we are in this world that is, kind of guided by white supremacy, in the world of hip hop, that's been flipped on its head, and there's sort of a black male supremacy that sort of operates kind of in contestation to not feeling accepted in mainstream society. And what then that has meant for women in the genre. You have done a lot of work in thinking about hip hop feminism. You've done a lot of work in crafting curriculum and syllabi that think about this very deeply. At what point did that become an entry point for you in your scholarly inquiry?
Just like the roots of starting to think about hip hop feminism and stuff. Well, so I worked as the teaching assistant for Mark Anthony Neal Ninth Wonder for 3 years. And Mark Anthony Neal actually grew up with Joan Morgan. They grew up in the same place in the Bronx.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah,
It makes total sense.
so they've known each other for a long time. So she came through to class one time, and I had read, her, of course, like seminal, I think it's 99, Chicken Has Come Home to Roost. And so I'd read that in his classes, and so I met her and got to interface with her. So I already had this kind of framework of thinking about it. And you got, this is around 2016. So this is right when we're seeing this current turn in hip hop where women are really dominating the charts, but we're not there yet at this point. We're just trying to get inklings of it. And then, of course, someone else who's just kind of in class sometimes is Rapsody. And so she's sitting, like 6 rows back, just listening to Ninth and Man Talk. And so she was on my radar too. This is Layla's Wisdom around that era, right before Eve. So Eve comes out 2019. This is my second year working for them. And, academics, like, it's like a really nerdy thing is like we put together syllabi, like when there's like a pop culture moment, it's like the blank syllabi or whatever, the To Pimp a Butterfly syllabus, So I was like in my super nerd and was like, I'm going to do an Eve syllabus. Because I reviewed it for Man's blog. And I was just completely blown away, 16 tracks. 16 names of prominent women, either in entertainment or characters or, real historical women. But like the kind of like portrait or anthology of Black womanhood that she paints in that album is breathtaking. Yeah. And so I was like, okay, well, shit, I've got this. And again, this is kind of like when I'm thinking about starting to study hip hop, I'm like, well, I've got this literary canon here. I've got this music here. There seems to be a conversation. I want to put it in stronger conversation, at least in my exposure. So that I made a syllabus, and I was like, and I wasn't planning on doing anything with it, but I had taught my requisite, composition sections in my PhD, and I had qualified to teach a literature course. And so instead of teaching like a survey to American literature, I said, hey, I've got this course. It's about this new album, but it's got all, I had Anna Julia Cooper back from 1896, sorry, all the way through like contemporary Brittany Cooper kind of, hip hop feminist work in the 2010s. And so they bid on it and they said yes. And so I launched the course in 2019, Rapsody's Even Hip Hop Feminism. And then now actually this coming spring is going to be the 5th year that I've taught it at Smith, the 5th section, which I'm really excited about and trying to plan some cool things for that too.
That's dope. I mean, clearly, like, when you're thinking about this at the level that you are, it becomes very rigorous. It becomes very granular. How are you getting undergraduate students to think about hip hop and feminism? And that's was one part. And then I guess the other part of it is, how do your male students in particular how are they, engaging with feminist scholarship, and then also do they perceive themselves to be feminists, and how have those conversations in class gone?
Okay, so I'm gonna answer the first one first, which is like, well, okay, thinking about how to bring all of that theoretical bridging down, to a classroom space. Well, I'm definitely the number one violator of doing too much in the classroom. Like, I'll send you my most recent version of the syllabus. I've got like A side, B side, and like bonus track readings, and we never get to any of that shit. But I'm like, but you have now a chronicle of all of the scholarship that relates to, So now what I did is I took each of the names. So like Cleo, which is, Queen Latifah's character, and set it off. The theme is speaking truth to power, right? And the political need to speak truth to power in terms of the history of Black women in the United States, right? And so what we do, when I say doing too much, the first day of the week, because each week is one name, one song, we do a close listening. We sit, I try to put all phones down, turn the lights off, turn the music up, get the lyrics on the screen, listen through at least once or twice. And we just meditate on the lyrics and try to understand the way, especially because Rapsody is such a dense lyricist, right? Yeah. Like, really sit and linger at the things that if you're really tired and it's 9:30 in the morning that you're not really going to catch, right? And so we spend time with that and getting into the theme, and maybe we'll get into one of the readings that day. Then the Thursday of each week, we get into various things. Like, there's a whole, for the Lake Kelly 47 feature, which is, I think it's on Oprah. We do Diane Kong's article about scamming aesthetics and how, like, what are the ethics of making money in a hyper-capitalist system when people are treated as commodities? Are there boundaries that you can read or not? And so we always have lively discussions about that. And to answer your second question that also answers the first, it's always really interesting. When I taught it one semester at Carolina, and white men tend to be very like, like liberal white men tend to be like very apologetic about it. Conservative white men would drop the class, to be honest. And this kind of like, well, I know I'm a white man, but that kind of thing. Which, we try to get into a bit more of a depth of engagement than that, because I think that in and of itself can be a form of racism. But that's a whole other conversation. But then in addition to that, like teaching in an HBCU context is really interesting because heterosexual relationships is at the center of a lot of our students' engagements, right? And I mean, at Smith, it's a Presbyterian or historically Presbyterian college, still fairly conservative. So it is very heterosexually focused, very few out students on campus. And as a queer man teaching this class, that's also a really interesting dynamic. I tell my students all the time, straight people are crazy, man. So like one incredible conversation that we had is Rapsody in Whoopi says, "I'm left eye with the matches." So one of my students is like, "Oh, I really like that." Because I just say, "What line stood out to you? Let's talk about it." And, hey, I really like that left eye line. Guy raises his hand to the back. What's that? Left eye with the matches? Like TLC? What do you mean? And then, three women turn around like, "You don't know," And so we talk about that. And then you get 4 or 5 women who are like, "Hell yeah. That's my shit," because of the righteousness of something like that and the violation of a depth of intimacy that could have been felt in that space, right? And of course, we're not talking about the actual incident, but how it signifies, right? And then you get guys who are like, "What?" Like, so if something goes left, you're gonna burn my house down, but what an opportunity.
Right.
So there was, this happened last semester when this really kind of got into it. I had this guy who was jumping out of his seat, and I just stood at the front, or I sat at the front of the classroom, sat on a desk, and I said, "Y'all talk."
Yeah, let this play out.
And then when it got to a point where it seemed like it was just kind of going back and forth, I said, "All right, now build a bridge. How do you understand, like, where these things connect with each other and how it relates to the power that Rapsody's trying to connote in the song?" Yeah. I didn't do any teaching. They literally, that whole thing taught itself because the students understood in an embodied level what was going on there, right? And my job was just to kind of like build up a little bit of dirt here so the water flows around, you know?
Man, I mean, and that's, I guess that almost speaks to like when people ask me like, what do I mean when I say hip hop pedagogy, or, you know, what do we mean when we say that, you know, hip hop is a way of teaching? That level of improvisation, or even that level of like just being a facilitator where energy can kind of travel and it's not like so didactic, and it's like, I am the controller of the room. I can just talk and hear myself talk, and that's all that matters. You know, to go back to like a Joan Morgan, it's like, it's in the grace where like the messiness is almost where the beauty is in hip hop. And I think like that's sort of what you had to kind of put on the table here. I've had a lot of conversations lately, and this is something that I believe I even spoke with Taylor about. You know, I've had a lot of I really only have about 2 weeks where I talk about hip hop feminism in my hip hop force here, and it always goes to this space of like, well, what is Megan really feminism? Is well, really feminism is City Girls really feminism? Is is Trina actually feminism? Or, you know, these certain artists that I think represent the flip side of the coin, so to speak. Like if we do binaries and female rap, there's like, okay, the Queen Mother conscious rap, and then there's the more fly girl, hypersexual, I don't want to use the term Jezebel, but like that kind of,
It's like
even the Sapphires is sort of condensed into that. So it's like the angry, loud, but also sexual black woman that's super ghetto fabulous and ready and available. And I guess scammer, stripper, rap also falls somewhere on that pendulum. But like those two, you know, aren't seen, at least by my students, as being feminists.
yeah, but Madonna is, you know,
Right. And,
or Miley, but
interestingly enough, like it won't be particularly. I find it like it's split down the middle now, where like there's these conversations about slut shaming and you know, sexual liberation, and like where those situations, there's half the room that is just like championing these artists, but then there's another half of the room that is like really skeptical. And I'm wondering how that, maybe not necessarily how it plays out in your classes, but just what are your thoughts, or how do you even end up speaking about this, you know, when you're thinking about like, what is hip hop feminism and how the artists of today fall into that definition?
yeah, well, I mean, there's a reason that across campuses we can name Lotto, Megan, you know, and the reason is that, like, to again be a little bit too much of a professor of that.
If we want to do Sexy Red now,
Yeah,
and Glorilla, these are the newer. I think this year is going to be Sexy Red.
Yeah,
more than any of the other just that we just named.
But okay, white folks drive consumption habits. Like we had since the SoundScan stuff of the 90s, where it's like, you know, primarily middle class white people listening to hip hop and so on. Right. The minstrel tradition was because white people were gobbling it up, paying tons and tons of money to see certain images, a certain kind of image that they themselves were creating. You know, this is the line in Beloved where Toni Morrison says that the jungle the white folks created came out of under their own skin. You know, that poignant moment. You know, I'm working on a Toni Morrison book chapter right now on Bluest Eye and Thieves in the Night. And so, yeah, thinking about those connections. But when you think about that, right, well, it was related to what you were talking about earlier with like black men kind of running hip hop, for lack of a better word, or being centered in hip hop for a really long time. I mean, I think that's more accurate. And the truth, like part of the reason that is white men extract a kind of masculinity out of that. And that because the blackness that white people created, you know, to be specific, we created a kind of blackness that we can extract things from, whether it's labor, but like it's all labor, but you know, it could be physical labor, it could be affective labor. And so like, that's why if you go, you know, I mean, I saw some Greek gatherings on the way over here. You go to kind of a frat house on a Saturday night.
There's a Greek village.
They're not over here like, okay, you know, what's Common really saying? I love hip hop, you know. No, it's drill and shit like that circulates, right? Because it's a certain kind of masculinity that white men can take and say, that's what it means to be a man, a hyper man. And it's the same thing with women. A lot of like some white feminists will take these figures and celebrate them in this very particular way, where it's like that's how you embrace your full-on feminine power, because a lot scamming in some ways is a harnessing of feminine power.
Yes.
Right? So when I think about all of that, if you're looking at a media landscape and you're reactively analyzing it and saying that that is what hip-hop is, you know, then you might have some issues with the lack of diversity in terms of both of those kinds of images, right? The hypermasculinity, the hyperfeminine or hypersexualized hyperfeminine. Then on the converse of that, though, I'm like, and again, I mentioned Leigh Kelly 47 earlier, we don't know who she is. She's, look, and I'm not trying to,
it's real.
I'm not trying to be like too provocative, but she's like a better Doom in terms of the like the persona. And I have this article that should be coming out soon about persona. I've been working with the artist, Purple Haze, who's up in Newark. But like thinking about the ways in which you don't get any access at all to any part of her, and she's still eating off of that. We do not know her government, as far as I know, and I've done some research, we don't know her government name. That's super powerful, right? But we're not talking about her when we're talking about this conversation. We're not talking about, of course, like, you know, everyone go, oh, you know, Rapsody is kind of like the Queen Latifah in terms of the discourse now, like, which I think does a disservice to both of them in their range. But I mean, I think about all of that. I think about, even in Charlotte, we've got this super dope artist, Sianka, who's like kind of straddling hip hop and R&B and is doing all of this shape shifting work, like super visual, like, really kind of incarnating some of the stuff. Missy doing her first solo tour this year. Those are the stories about, you know, why aren't we or why are we centering things that I'm more interested in when we think about, when we're asking, do we count this as feminism or not? My question is, do you even have the range to ask that question?
Wow.
And most people, when they ask it, don't.
Yeah.
That's so real. I mean, that's a jewel that I'll take into my class, because that's a conversation that I think has come up so much that I had to give it an extra week.
Yeah.
To sort of say, okay, like, I'm going to throw you the readings, and we're going to go through sort of the history, and we're going to talk about, you know, some of the things that, you know, I want to lay out from this playlist that I gave you. But I also want to meet you where you're at, and I want to kind of continue this conversation, because almost every time the conversation seems like it's only just getting started.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was talking to you and you were like, I have this entire kind of like corpus of like work that, like, you know, to bring into the classroom an entire course on hip hop feminism, or even just one singular artist that represents a facet of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's dope to me. I just feel like it's tough to sell it to the powers that be. But like, I think that's where we're headed if we're going to take hip hop studies to another level, in terms of thinking about it as being, you know, bigger than just the relationship to the industry, or just its relationship to poverty, or just its relationship to blackness. That being said, you know, I've been challenged in the last couple of years about, you know, a hip hop feminism that includes queerness a lot more. And I'm wondering your thoughts, or even what you might even have been seeing in your classroom, or on your campus, in terms of students. I found, you know, Black queer students are almost driving community in the most innovative ways of which I'm seeing within, campus community and politics. And I'm also seeing that online, and I'm seeing that more and more even when I go out into social settings. And I'm wondering if that was something that was there all along, and maybe we're just now taking notice, or whether maybe that's the new frontier of how, people are now looking at, women are taking over. Is there a space where kind of not necessarily just artists, but where like now that we're in this digital space, right? We're in this era where like even when people talk Black Twitter, I've always said is Black Women's Twitter and Black Queer Twitter that sort of drove Black Twitter, right? And why are we not talking about that? Could you see a space and time where hip hop is more accepting of queerness and its contribution to the culture?
Yeah. It's a very good question. I think we have to kind of differentiate queerness in order to understand kind of where we're at right now, because we do have more out artists now in hip hop than ever before. Most of those out artists are bisexual women, right? So if we think about and sometimes people don't really recognize fully how much like Megan Thee Stallion represents bisexuality very loudly, right? You've got hip hop adjacent people like Victoria Monet, and I think Tiana Teo is bisexual. She's out. And then you've got also like very public out queer folks like Young M.A. and Sid from Odd Future, right? So, but all these are femmes, right? In New Orleans, we've got a specific thing going on, right? And I've been thinking a lot through. I'm reviewing Lauren Kerr's Queer Voices in Hip Hop for the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and so I've been thinking a lot about some of their work and what they've done on queer voices. So a lot of this is echoing their work, to be clear. But like the Sissy Bounce movement in New Orleans, and how that also echoes a longer history of kind of like tolerance and engagement in that specific scene that then leaks into music like Beyonce's music and Drake's music and so on, right? So we're in a queer moment. Now we're all the queer guys, and I think because and this is the thing about, we always talk about queerness and hip hop as if queerness in American culture was not already a thing. Right. And not already a problem in American culture. And so American ideas of masculinity makes queer masculinity a problem. Like queerness is a violation of being masculine. If hip hop's whole point for a lot of white Americans is to sell a kind of hyper black masculinity, a queer hyper black masculinity doesn't make a lick of sense. But queer womanhood, that doesn't violate womanhood at all. If anything, it's a hyper distillation of womanhood rather than a violation of it, right? And so then women are allowed a certain kind of play with that work, right? And we can even think about this in terms of not homosexual, but homosocial affection, right? And the kinds of arrays of behaviors that are disallowed or allowed in homosocial spaces, right? You don't see men holding hands, right, or sitting on each other's laps, right? And I mean, that's like an old and very crude kind of example, but it's a very real one nonetheless. And then transness being, a space of complete abjection, being a traitor to the very thing which you are supposed to hold very dear, right? But to answer your kind of original question, so sorry, to kind of like wrap back around, the point is that like I think we're in a moment where we're seeing an opening, but that opening is like very specific. And I think that, as Regina Bradley hopefully would approve of, the future lays in the South. When we think about Saucy Santana, we think about Sissy Bounce in New Orleans. The South has a futuristic understanding of gender that the rest of the country simply does not have. And they've been practicing it without anyone's permission. And that, I think, is a huge, and I haven't written anything about this. I've been thinking about it for a long time, but the more that I think about hip hop in the South and its legacy in sound, and that sound's legacy in the blues before it, and the blues is gender politics with Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith being queer artists who are out queer artists, and Liner Notes for the Revolution, who's the author, writes about this. Shit, I'm sorry to this author that I'm forgetting. But anyways, my point is that, like, I think that there is an opening, and that opening is going to be led by the South. Now, to answer your original question about, like, are Black queer activists kind of at the center of everything? Yeah, absolutely. Charlotte Pride's coming up this weekend.
Yeah.
Marsha P. Johnson is the reason that we have Pride of Black, queer, trans activists, right? So when we think about this legacy, and being on a HBCU, just to keep it absolutely real, I've got a lot of folks who think queerness is a white thing, and are very surprised to learn that the modern pride movement and so on comes from Black queer spaces, not white queer spaces, And that's a whole other conversation. But my point is that, like, I think across the board, we do not recognize the queer activists who are driving and have driven social change at literally every chapter of America's evolution over time.
So real. I have one last question before we sort of move out of this episode. We've had a lot of serious conversation today. It moved around in a lot of theory and authors and so on and so forth. In terms of just like where you are currently, who are some artists that you think, newer artists that you think sort of exemplify kind of like where you want to see hip hop going? And this is just more personal preference, not, a blanket statement for what others might like. But what are you listening to? Who are you watching? And who are you excited about?
Yeah,
in terms of hip hop, and that can be local to Charlotte, but it could be national or global or whoever.
I've been leaning a lot into the Charlotte scene. So that's like what first comes to mind. I already mentioned Sianka, super dope. Everybody go listen to Sianka. Mavi, an incredible rapper from Charlotte. I know a lot of people know him nationwide. He just released his most recent album, Shadowbox. Anything you want. You want lyricism. You want, like, sonic butteriness. You want, like, great visuals. You want thoughtfulness. You want revolutionary thought. Like, it's all right there. I mean, Mavi, and he's a friend too, and a dear friend who's actually coming up for dinner tonight. So yeah, I am plugging my friend, but also check him out. I mean, Pitchfork just gave him an 8 out of 10, which is a serious thing.
For them, that's a lot.
Yeah, and so I think Mavi's someone, and especially when we think about straight artists who's really thinking about freedom in a more broad sense in the way that we were just talking about. He's got this song off his first album where he's like, and for anyone who's like down for the Me Too, for my brothers, we're not free until they're free too, and like, I remember the first time that I watched him perform that, like, I'm even getting emotional now just thinking about it, like, because you don't see that in hip hop in ways that are not corny as fuck, like Macklemore and shit like that, right? Sorry, I don't know if I can curse, but okay. So, salutes to Mavi. Ruben Vincent, another young man from Charlotte. He's, of course, under Ninth's tutelage for a long time. Just came out with his first debut album last year. Third artist ever to be signed to Roc Nation from North Carolina. J. Cole, Rapsody, and now Ruben. Super genuine dude, and has been doing a lot of interesting stuff with his family. Entire family's from Liberia. He's been doing a really interesting stuff with his beats, as he's produced for himself more recently too. So those come to mind right away. Of course, I love everything Tierra Whack's doing. It's just like, I love people who are just like, you know what, fuck it, I'm gonna do whatever I want to do. And if y'all like it, great. And if not, whatever. So I really love what she's doing. And then, I don't know, this is more R&B, but hip hop adjacent. Sonny Miles in Raleigh, North Carolina. actually made Obama's summer playlist in like 2019. But his last album, Gamma, again, kind of like R&B hip hop combination type situation. Like he's hip hop in the way D'Angelo was hip hop, if that makes sense.
Makes sense.
Okay. And wow, and he's under the tutelage of Fonte from Little Brother, and he sequenced his last album. And I got to shout out Loot too, who's under the tutelage of Pooh, up in Charlotte. But anyways, those are the folks that like I actually been working on some creative stuff from Mobby's album surrounding like liner notes and stuff like that. So I've been really sitting with that one for a while. Like, so I love that, but just don't sleep on Charlotte rappers, man. Like there's a serious scene in it, and it's really picking up a lot of beautiful momentum. So,
man, the last thing I want to ask you is something I've been asking sort of like every person that I've talked to, no matter if they're academic or not. And that's about this concept of joy, which is something that has come up a lot in conversations that I've been having over the last 2 years. I think first it started off as just like as a response to folks saying like, well, why is everything about resistance? Why do we frame everything about resistance? It's like, why can't we just have joy in just being and like what brings us joy? Like, and that just moved into a space where I just started asking people like, oh, what in their life is bringing them joy in the present moment? And so I'll bring that question to you. In this present moment, like what are some things that bring you joy in media or otherwise, or just little things that
keep you going?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Yeah, like I said, a lot of the creatives who I just listed, like, I interface with them and get to learn from them. And that I think even in this period of my life, I am embracing that maybe I might be more of a creative than I've given myself credit for in the past. So that embracing that a little bit, and having my therapist really push me towards that has been like, that's brought me definitely some joy. But all the time, I'm nice in the kitchen, man. I taught myself how to cook in college, and then started to read like textbooks and stuff like that. And so I got really, really, really serious about it. I've catered a wedding and like done some stuff like that. So I like that to me. In fact, I scoop here for Mobby tonight. I'm gonna make this like yuzu soy reduction to put on top of some salmon and like do like some sushi rice bowls with that. It's gonna be crazy, but. Yeah, so I've been really leaning into that this summer too. I've been doing this Sunday dinner series and having creatives from all over Charlotte come on one Sunday a month, and just to come eat. Just donate $3 and I'll cover all the costs and everything, and just come and break bread and hang out. Did the first one last month, and it was like, yeah, if you've ever watched like, I don't know. There's just like it was that moment of gathering, where it's just. You don't know you guys got to meet, that kind of thing. Oh, there's nothing more beautiful than that.
Yeah, I had a friend, Aja Monet. She's a poet.
Yeah, I've heard the name.
She was in Miami at one point. I think now she's moved to LA. But she used to do this thing called Offline, and it was just like, oh, these are people we know online, but like we never meet offline. And she would kind of do that, like have folks, playing music in her backyard and just kind of eating and fellowship and just, just kind of being in community with one another, but also the sharing of ideas. And it's amazing how food can be that glue. And I guess that's also a Southern thing, I suppose.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Where food can bring folks together and you see these things manifest themselves right in front of your eyes. That's dope. So now you just put something in my ear to text you about when next.
I got you. Absolutely. Yeah.
But Tyler, I want to thank you for coming all this way, joining us on the pod, but also, man, just really, since I know you, you've been so generous and you've been a willing participant in every conversation that I've invited you to. And so I really appreciate you. Yeah. And I want to give you your flowers for what you do, because it's hard to maintain the energy. I think that's the one thing about academia, and is like, I think we all start off wide-eyed and bushy-tailed and have a lot of, goals and things that we want to do, but we're also just very optimistic. And I think sometimes this industry, if you want to call it that, or this line of work, can find a way to beat that optimism out of you. And I think you're a shining example of somebody who like goes hard and goes at it, and has a true mission in what they're doing. And so I thank you for your work, but I thank you for being here.
I appreciate that. Well, and on the bit of joy too, part of joy along those lines, because like I know I look like I came out the womb yesterday, but I have been doing this for a little bit of a minute, and the trick is also like saying fuck it to the things that don't work. And to me, like if I had to abdicate being a professor tomorrow and still get to do the work, I don't care. I don't care if you call me doctor, like, and that's not some fake humility stuff. It's like, you got to stay focused on what matters.
Yep.
Because that's where the joy is. The joy is when I have a student who is kind of miserable in her chemistry class, in her chemistry major, interviewing Raw Digga because her dad was a rapper in Newark, and I get Raw to come and sit, and they sit together. Raw also got accepted to MIT and decided not to go.
That's crazy.
Right? And this is a student who also dabbles in music and so on. And it's like, I don't give a fuck about the assessment portfolios I have to turn in. That's what matters. I'll be late on that because this is what matters. And that to me, like especially in the academy, is what you got to do to maintain that joy. But I appreciate the flowers because, yeah, it's dark and hard sometimes. Yeah.
And it's no problem. That is not a problem on my end. I see what you're doing as valuable, and that's sometimes that's all we need to hear to keep
100%
the wheels and the gears turning. So that's an episode. That's the pod, Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Jabari Evans. This is Tyler Bunzey, and we're out.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, leave a rating or review. And to catch the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at KnowledgeSense82 and on Twitter at KnowledgeSense82. Now that's different than how you normally would spell it. That's NALEDGE, Sense 82, as in 1982. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Peace.